Did Adam have a first wife before Eve? The question sounds like the opening line of a myth or a modern novel, but it actually points to a real historical puzzle. The Hebrew Bible contains two different creation scenes that, when read side by side, leave room for other voices and other figures to enter the story. Tracing those voices leads us not to a single, neat answer, but to a long, layered conversation that stretches from the literary seams of Genesis into the deserts and temples of ancient Mesopotamia, through prophetic poetry, into medieval folk tales and household magic, and finally into modern reinterpretations. This is the story of Lilith, not a single fixed being, but a family of ideas and images, night spirits, amulets, a medieval first wife legend, and a modern emblem of autonomy woven across millennia. Begin with the Genesis tension. In the first creation account, the short, sweeping narrative of Genesis 1, human beings are created together. Male and female are made in the image of the Creator, as a pair brought into being in the same divine act. In the second account, with a different voice and a different emphasis, a man is formed first from the earth, and then a woman is fashioned from his side. For many readers, ancient and modern alike, the difference is striking. It invites an interpretive move. If the text seems to contain two different traditions, one where humanity arises as a pair, another where the woman is derived from the man, might there have been other traditions, lost or later developed, that tried to fill the gap? Some interpreters in antiquity and the Middle Ages answered that question by imagining other female figures connected to humanity's origins. Among these, one name eventually became prominent: Lilith. To be clear from the start, the canonical earliest layers of the Genesis text do not name a first wife named Lilith. The image of Lilith as Adam's first spouse is not a claim of the biblical book itself. What we find instead is a complex historical trail in which Mesopotamian ideas about night spirits, a single cryptic word in a prophetic poem, and medieval Jewish storytelling combined and recombined over time into the popular legend that would eventually call her Adam's first wife. Maybe if you're enjoying this deep dive into the history of ideas, like and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. If you value careful, historically grounded explorations like this, where texts, archaeology, and cultural memory intersect, consider subscribing to the channel. We publish new deep dives every day, following ideas across centuries rather than chasing simple answers. Tracing Lilith requires moving west to the cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, where the roots of many Near Eastern demonologies lie. In Akkadian and Sumerian texts, we meet figures called Lilitu, Lilitu, or similar forms, words that linguistically point toward wind, spirit, or night being, depending on context. These were not goddesses in the high sense of Inanna or Ishtar, but rather a class of folkloric or supernatural beings associated with the night, the desert, and dangerous liminal spaces. They appear in a variety of genres: incantations against disease, lists of dangerous spirits, and fragments of myths and poems. In some texts, they are implicated in infant mortality and illness. In others, they are described as visiting men at night in sexualized encounters. In short, the Mesopotamian Lilitu-type figures functioned as explanations for misfortune that could not be easily controlled: stillbirth, sudden sickness, frightening nocturnal phenomena, and therefore they were woven into the practical magic of household life. Archaeology echoes the texts. Figurines, carved plaques, and incantation artifacts from the 3rd millennium BCE onward show how pervasive the idea of night spirits was. One striking image that often enters conversations about Lilith is the so-called Burney relief. Dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE and sometimes called the Queen of the Night plaque, it depicts a winged, nude female figure flanked by owls and standing atop lions. Some scholars see in her a fertility or underworld deity. Others caution that she is not necessarily the same as Mesopotamian Lilitu. The relief evokes the same symbolic world, the night, wild animals, and a kind of dangerous femininity, but it must be handled carefully. Archaeological images do not come labeled with modern names, and the Burney figure may be part of a broader iconography rather than a direct portrait of a single mythic character. Still, when you place this visual material alongside amulets and incantation texts that explicitly name Lilitu figures, a picture emerges of a shared cultural concern about nocturnal threats and their anthropomorphic representations. Fast forward west to the Hebrew Bible, and you encounter a single, puzzling occurrence of a related word. In Isaiah 34, a vivid passage of prophetic judgment against Edom lists desolation scenes in which wild creatures inhabit ruined cities, wild oxen, jackals, owls, and a term in Hebrew that appears as Lilith in many manuscripts. Translators have long debated how to render that word. Some ancient versions, Greek and Latin translations, opted for generic night creature or a specific bird known to classical readers. Later, English translations sometimes use screech owl, night monster, or simply night spirit. The single biblical occurrence does not give us a narrative about Adam. It places a lexical witness to a possible Near Eastern tradition of night demons within a poetic roster of desolation. Linguistically and contextually, Isaiah's Lilith likely refers to a kind of nocturnal being or creature of the wilderness, an image that would later be read against extra-biblical traditions. Between Mesopotamian lore and medieval Jewish exegesis, a long history of contact and reinterpretation takes place. In late antiquity and the early medieval centuries, Jews living in and around Mesopotamia had frequent exposure to the same cosmological vocabulary as their neighbors. Spirits, amulets, and protective rituals circulated in multilingual communities. People did not live with abstract theology alone. They experienced illness, infant loss, and unexplained nocturnal events. It is in this world of lived religion that supernatural figures are named and negotiated through ritual action. Enter the alphabet of Ben Sira, a medieval text that plays a decisive role in the story of Lilith as Adam's first wife. Composed roughly between the 8th and 10th centuries CE, scholars debate exact dating and provenance. The alphabet is not scripture, but a kind of folk midrash, playful, moralizing, and often satirical. One of its most famous tales supplies precisely what readers had been imagining. A woman named Lilith is formed at the same time and from the same earth as Adam. The text stages a confrontation over equality and submission. When Adam insists that she lie beneath him sexually, Lilith refuses, arguing that the two were created equal. She utters a divine name, liberates herself, and flees the garden. Later, the legend says, angels pursue her or make a bargain. She will not destroy certain households if certain rituals are performed, if amulets are hung, if specific names are written, if newborns are protected by formulas. Thus, a narrative that merges gendered moral concern, a woman who refuses to submit, with practical religious measures, amulets and angelic names, is born. The alphabet story is often colorful. Lilith is portrayed as dangerous to newborns and to men who sleep alone, and a roster of angelic names like Senoi, Sansanoi, and Samanjalof appears in popular retellings as the protective trio who carry out negotiations. That roster itself reflects the way late antique and medieval Judaism incorporated local folk practices into its imaginative universe. Angels in the story function as cosmic mediators between the divine order and human households. Yet again, the historian's caution is necessary. The alphabet of Ben Sira is a much later folkloric composition. It is not a biblical document, and it does not represent a definitive or uniform Jewish belief across time and space. It is, however, an influential tale that explains how the idea of Lilith as Adam's first wife gained narrative flesh. Material culture records complement the tale. Across the Near East and into Jewish communities of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, people used amulets, incantation bowls, and inscribed vessels to ward off harmful spirits. Some of these objects explicitly name Lilith or use language associated with night demons, and a number of incantation formulas include demands, divorces, or expulsion formulas directed at supernatural beings. There are bowls inscribed to bind a spirit to the bowl, to prevent it from returning, or to force it to speak the truth. In some cases, a substitute marriage contract appears among the rituals, a kind of written divorce that severs the supposed bond between a newborn and a dangerous spirit. These practices are not, in the modern sense, superstition to be dismissed. They are evidence of how communities used ritual language to manage uncertainty and grief. When infant mortality was tragically common, amulets and protective names became pragmatic tools, social technology for dealing with the unpredictable. If you follow Lilith's trail further into the medieval and early modern European imagination, you find her sometimes conflated with other nocturnal figures, succubi and incubi who visit sleepers sexually, or witches who prey on children. Christian demonologies classified a wide range of harmful beings under familiar headings, and popular folklore blurred the lines between local night creatures, classical sirens or strigas, and the Semitic Lilith. This is part of the danger in telling a single linear story. The figure we call Lilith is braided together from multiple traditions, sometimes overlapping, sometimes only loosely connected. Medieval folklorists and demonologists were not always careful about provenance. They were, however, consistent in using narratives about dangerous women, either sexualized, solitary, or otherwise transgressive, to explain social anxieties. The 20th century brought another major transformation. As modern feminist thought engaged with religious texts and cultural symbols, Lilith was reclaimed by many as an emblem of female independence. Scholars and activists like Judith Plaskow and others in Jewish feminist circles read the Lilith story as a critique of patriarchal expectations. In this modern retelling, Lilith's refusal to submit becomes emblematic of resistance to enforced gender roles. The Jewish feminist magazine Lilith, for example, explicitly invokes this reclaimed figure as a namesake and a symbol for reimagining Jewish female identity. In art, literature, and scholarship, Lilith shifted from threatening night spirit to powerful archetype, still contested, still multifaceted, and now deliberately mobilized as a positive force for many. Throughout all these transformations, a consistent theme emerges. Lilith functions as cultural shorthand for what societies fear or repress about women's autonomy. As a demon, she justifies protective rituals and household practices. As a folk heroine, she becomes a mouthpiece for dissent. We can understand this pattern sociologically. Stories and symbols get demonized or beautified in order to do social work, explain unwelcome phenomena, enforce norms, or provide models of resistance. A crucial textual point anchors this historical narrative. Isaiah's lone use of a related term shows how a lexical tradition can survive in different forms without carrying a single, stable myth. The word in Isaiah could be translated in several ways, and ancient translators did not agree. Some turned it into a kind of nocturnal bird, others deployed a generic night creature. Later, medieval readers read it against known demonologies and associated it with spiriting beings that threatened children. Translation choices matter because they shape later interpretive possibilities. A single ambiguous word in a prophetic text is not the same as a full narrative, but it can become a seed for stories when it meets other cultural materials and needs. Another caution: we should not conflate Lilith with Mesopotamian goddesses such as Inanna or Ishtar. Although similarities exist, female imagery, associations with sexuality and danger, iconographic motifs, the comparison must be precise. Inanna, Ishtar are complex, multifaceted goddesses with state cults and literary epics. The Lilith-type beings are, by contrast, lower-level supernatural actors in a more domestic, magical register. Conflating them erases important distinctions in ancient religious praxis and textual genres. Material evidence of ritual practice helps ground the imagination in lived reality. Incantation bowls from late antiquity, examples of amulets inscribed with names and formulas, and other votive objects give us direct access to how people attempted to control the unseen. Some of these objects name beings that later traditions equated with Lilith. Others use generic language that scholars read as evidence of a shared cultural vocabulary for night demons. The presence of divorce formulas, written pronouncements intended to cancel a supernatural bond, speaks to a mentality in which naming and writing exerted real social and ritual power. Those artifacts are not proof of Lilith in the biblical Adam story. They are, however, clear testimony that the figure, or figures like her, mattered in domestic and ritual life. How then should we answer the title question, was Lilith Adam's first wife? The historically accurate response is nuanced, yes and no. There is a medieval Jewish narrative, preserved in texts like the Alphabet of Ben Sira and in related folklore, that explicitly imagines Lilith as the first wife of Adam, created as his equal, refusing subordination, and expelled from Eden. That narrative was influential and became part of a wider constellation of beliefs about night spirits that affected household practice and popular imagination. But that medieval narrative is not the same as the canonical Genesis text. The Bible itself never names a first wife called Lilith. The Genesis materials do not claim her as Adam's partner. What connects the pieces is cultural conversation. Mesopotamian Lilith figures offered imagery. A lone biblical word provided a lexical echo. Medieval creativity supplied a narrative expansion, and amulets and incantations show how such figures were dealt with on the ground. Over centuries, various elements braided together to produce the familiar legend. Remember, too, that Lilith is not a single fixed entity. Across time and place, she appears as a desert demon, a night spirit, a threat to infants, a sexual visitor, a medieval first wife, and a modern feminist icon. Each of these Liliths answers particular social and theological questions. Where communities faced the terrors of infant mortality, illness, and violation of bodily boundaries, stories and rituals featuring dangerous women and night spirits offered explanations and remedies. Where modern readers confront patriarchal narratives, Lilith offers an alternative model, a powerful figure who resists subordination. One more scholarly caveat: this is a historical reconstruction based on texts and artifacts, and different scholars draw different conclusions. Some emphasize direct lines of influence from Mesopotamia into Israelite tradition, others stress independent development and later recombination. Philology, archaeology, and comparative religion each provide partial evidence. Together, they allow us to sketch a plausible trajectory without claiming certainty where sources are ambiguous. What does this long afterlife of Lilith tell us about religion and culture more broadly? First, that myths and marginal words can be powerful seeds. A single term in a prophetic poem, a motif in a foreign ritual text, or a popular amulet can become the basis for entire narratives that serve social, psychological, and ritual purposes. Second, labels like demon or goddess are often modern shorthand that obscure the many ways people in antiquity thought about the unseen. Third, the story of Lilith is a case study in how gendered anxiety can be mythologized. Female independence becomes, in some traditions, demonic, while in others it becomes a figure for liberation. Finally, the variety of Lilith figures reminds us that cultural exchange is messy. Words, images, and rituals travel, are reinterpreted, mixed with local beliefs, and gradually remade. If you want to keep exploring this territory, there are rich avenues to follow. Detailed studies of Mesopotamian incantations and the vocabulary of Lilith, close textual work on Isaiah and its Septuagint and Latin translations, manuscript histories and critical editions of the alphabet of Ben Sira, and catalogs of amulets and incantation bowls that show ritual practice in vivid detail. And for those interested in the contemporary afterlife of Lilith, look at feminist theologians, artists, and writers who have reclaimed the figure, and at how Lilith functions in modern literature and popular culture. To return to the question posed at the beginning, discovering Lilith, the untold story of Adam's first wife, is a useful framing because it points to a real story, one that is untold in the sense that it is not part of the oldest biblical layer, but is an accretion of later creativity, cultural contact, and ritual necessity. The claim that Lilith was Adam's first wife is accurate for certain medieval traditions and for many modern retellings that draw on those traditions, but it should not be read back into the canonical text of Genesis as an original biblical assertion. Instead, Lilith is best understood as a composite cultural figure, plural, evolving, and deeply revealing about the fears, hopes, and interpretive energies of the communities that told her story. If you found this exploration valuable, I've linked sources in the description and a related video on angelic and demonic figures across cultures. And if you'd like more history of religion deep dives like this, consider subscribing. We publish new videos every day. I'll see you in the next one.